Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And we're recording this on November 6th in the morning after the election. And the world right now feels, to me anyways, a bit scarier, a bit more uncertain, a bit more confusing. And I'm feeling the need to make sense of it. And I'm glad you've joined us to do this together, because one of the things I've come to realize is how much when I'm confused, anxious, discouraged, and I'm feeling all of those feelings plus more, I really do need friends. I do best in making sense of the confusing inner world as well as the external world that is present right now when I'm doing it with others. And I'm doing this right now with two friends that I really can't imagine two friends I would more want to have this conversation with than my friends David French and Russell Moore. David and Russell, it's good to see your faces and welcome. Welcome to this Good Faith recording. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much, Curtis. This is, as we'll get into, there is nothing surprising about this day for me. So it's good to share it with you guys. And I'm looking forward to talking this thing through.
And I can confirm that there is nothing surprising for David in this day, because this is exactly what he's been saying would happen for a very, very long time.
And the reason for some dark gallows humor texts that we've been exchanging among the three of us here. I want to make just a quick caveat. A lot of people associate us with the after party curriculum that we've created, that we created really to help Christians think about the how of politics. And because of that, the three of us in the after party, in our roles as the after party, were very intent to steer away from making any statement or encouragement on partisan leanings, on our own political viewpoints. We were calling people to a Jesus-centered how of politics. This is a Good Faith recording. This is not the after party curriculum. We're coming as David, Russell, Curtis, and all of our feelings, thoughts that both include the how, but also about the what as well. So we're going to actually be sharing kind of, our feelings that really reveal, which will not be a surprise to many of you, kind of how we are thinking and feeling on the what of politics as well. So I just wanted to make that clear. One of the things that I think is also really important for us to recognize is that there's, at least for a certain personality profile that I think may characterize the three of us, is there's a quick move to want to make sense of things analytically, maybe even spiritually or theologically. I think in a moment like this, it's really important also, and maybe to start with emotionally. There's a lot of feelings at play, I know, inside me, inside our listeners. And so I wanted to actually just help us name and describe the inner emotional landscape that we're feeling now, that we felt in the last 24 hours. Russell, I want to ask you to start. What describe your inner emotional landscape, what it's been like and what it is now.
Well, I mean, if you think about, again, this isn't an after party event, but you think about what we talked about in after party, I fit myself more in the exhausted category, or maybe you fit me more in the exhausted, and I claim it. But I think that's kind of still where I am, especially because I know that we now have a lot of drama that is going to be just in every American's life all the time from now on. I think a lot of people like that. And I think clearly one of the things that is reassuring to me about this election is I don't feel like anybody was hoodwinked. I think that both candidates were very, very clearly who they are, what they're going to do, and the American people made a choice. So that's reassuring to me. So I don't think that there's a sense in which, well, the American people don't know the drama they're signing up for. But I know that's going to be the case, and it's going to be a question of how does one navigate that in the years to come, just spiritually, without getting just driven downward by all of it, regardless of where somebody stands politically. So that's kind of where I am right now.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that and get to what it looks like for us to adopt a posture that doesn't get driven downward. David, what about you? What's your emotional landscape?
You know, it's funny. Yesterday morning, I woke up, Tuesday morning, election day morning, I woke up with this just sense that it was weird after kind of going back and forth. If you would ask me, at 6 o'clock on Monday afternoon, is Trump going to win? I would have said no. And then at 7 o'clock, if you asked me, I would have said, well, yes, he is. And then at 8, it really was that sort of back and forth because there was just no data available to indicate how this was all definitely going to shake out. I think a lot of smart people made the correct call that this was actually not going to end up being that close, that there was going to be a polling miss. We just didn't know which direction. So, I had that analytical side of my brain, just like, well, we don't know. Well, so then that meant the emotional side of my brain just sort of swung back and forth based mainly on vibes. The worst way to sort of to think through the situation. But as it became very clear that Trump was going to win, what really settled in my mind was this idea that despair is a luxury. And because, look, if Trump is going to do what he says he's going to do, so, and which is always an open question, by the way, so there's this very interesting dynamic where there's a bunch of Trump supporters who vote for him because they're sure he's not going to do what he says. And then there's a bunch who vote for him because they're sure he is going to do what he says. So there's this kind of weird, when you talk to people who supported Trump, you say, are you for this and this and this? And they'll say, no, not at all. I just don't think he'll do it. And so in my view, this sort of despair, this sort of idea that that I can't participate, that exhaustion, which we all feel it. I mean, I don't think there's anybody who woke up this morning and said, I can't wait for 4 more years of this. I mean, in MAGA for sure, but outside of that, we're all exhausted. But the question is, what does it lead us to do? And, one of the feelings that I had was we're going to have many of us who have stable jobs, who have good families, who have good friends, we're going to be fine. We're going to be fine. But there's a lot of vulnerable people out there who are not going to be fine. And so I just sort of thought of it in this 2 ways. One is defend the vulnerable. I mean, this is literally what I'm writing right now. Defend the vulnerable and speak the truth.
Yeah.
And so I feel like if we give in to despair, that's going to lead us to retreat into our own cocoon, our own bubble, right? And so we have to lean out of that and into the defense of people. And it's not just sort of legislatively or legally. And then, you can't just delegate it to members of Congress or to lawyers. Look, in the public square, a lot of what happened today or yesterday depended on constant, relentless animosity and dehumanization. A lot of this would not have occurred but for that, in particular of immigrants, for example. And so one of the things that we need to do, even if we're not a lawyer, even if we're not a legislator, is stand up for the dignity and humanity of vulnerable people in this period. So that's where I am. I'm just kind of trying to gear up and get ready to try to do that very thing.
This is why I love hanging out and talking with David and Russell, because they call me to my better self. Like Russell's already calling me, hey, put on your pastoral hat. How do you help people navigate this spiritually? David's putting on his political hat. How do we defend the vulnerable? I'm sorry, guys. I'm still wallowing in my feelings right now. I was trying to catalog my feelings yesterday, and forgive me, but I was like journaling about this, and they all start with A. You can't take the pastor out of me. The alliterative sermonizing. This was my emotional journey. So I started in anxiety, and the way I dealt with my anxiety at around 5 p.m. was I went into big avoidance mode. I spent probably about 2 hours just digitizing my photos, cleaning out my bookshelf, clearing out the garage. I mean, this election, I think, was a disaster for our country, but it did wonders for my to-do list. I just plowed through it as a matter of avoidance. Then around when I saw what was happening, I felt a surge of anger. And then I felt like a surge. I was like, what's behind that anger? Like I was just wanting to blame people for this outcome. And then I was like, oh, I'm actually feeling like anguish. I'm feeling sadness. As David, I think especially immigrants, the people of Ukraine, our
Yes,
our
yes. Oh
our
gosh, yes.
planet, in terms of our future generations. I was feeling anguish for my daughters, who I know are growing up as young women who interpreted this election result as a rejection of women at some level, and a bequeathing of them of world of that feels like despairing to them. So I was feeling with anguish of that, and then I ended last night. Well, I actually didn't end there, but I got to a place of just also, I guess the best word I could put it was alienation. I just felt like, is this my country? Like, what does it mean that this is my country, and this is my and my so many of my fellow Christians help produce this result. So I was just the full gamut, and I think I'm still sorting through the combination of anxiety, avoidance, anger, anguish, alienation. I'm all over the map. But let's sort of sort out a little bit of this. I have there's a one of the our listeners, Kyle on Facebook, called out two of those emotions. He said, Kyle wrote, I feel angry at the coming storm and also guilty and shameful that it is driven in such large part by Christians, no matter who each of us votes for. So those are two very large emotions, anger and guilt or shame. I want to sort through those two very large emotions with you, David, starting with anger. David, help us help people who are feeling angry now. How do we process the angry? What should we be angry about? And then how might we need to temper that anger?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to tell people don't be angry. I mean, scripture says you can be angry but do not sin. So
Yeah.
how if we're angry, then the question is, what do we do about it? How do we channel that? How, if it is consuming us, what do we do about it? And look, I think there's a couple of, there's a couple of things that we need to do in this moment. One is channel the anger appropriately. And that's when I talk about, okay, what's the vision going forward? What's the vision? And that's when I talked about these two things: defend the vulnerable, speak the truth, channel into that. And by the way, that's going to require courage. It's going to require courage, because the one thing that we know after dealing with MAGA for 9 years is even engagement is painful. It's not just painful to lose an election. That is painful, of course, but it's often just painful to engage, because you then find yourself subject to an amount of cruelty. So channel some of that anger into courage. Channel some of that anger into building up those muscles and that sort of thickness of the skin that is necessary to engage in a very cruel age, but without surrendering your compassion. Remember the Micah 6:8 formula: we need to lean in to act justly. You just can't surrender kindness. You can't surrender humility. So in that sense, I think channel anger into moral courage. But also another thing is, we absolutely need to take a minute and take stock and reflect on where we are. And why is it that so many people felt that Trump's opponents were not hearing them, were not listening to them? And here's a dynamic that I saw over the last 8-9 years, and I don't know the way out of it. So here's the dynamic. If you were opposed to Trump and you highlighted and talked about the failures that existed in the existing establishment, the way the existing sort of political system was failing people, in many ways, that was seen as sort of helping Donald Trump, because he was ever since he secured his hold on the establishment or on the GOP, he was the political alternative. So if you're criticizing the status quo, a lot of people said, well, you're doing nothing but helping Trump. But then if you did not criticize plainly problematic things about the status quo, so that you were constantly dealing with the greater issue of Donald Trump, well, that let millions of people think you didn't care about and you weren't focused on the things that were making their life difficult. And Trump was honing in on those things on a day-to-day basis. And so we have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. You have to be able to say, there are things about the status quo that are not good, that are failing, where our system is failing Americans in some important ways, at the same time that we say, this is not the answer. This is a cure that can be worse than the disease. And this is a very difficult balancing act to pull off, especially in a public square that takes any criticism sort of your own side as betrayal, as weakness in the face of the hated enemy. And so we have to have the moral courage to continue to reflect on the failings of our own team, even as we recognize the emerging dangers of this coming term.
Okay, Russell, what about this feeling of guilt or shame, the sense that we as Christians, we were part of this. We helped bring this about. Trump does not get elected without the overwhelming support of American evangelicals. How do we process that going forward, Russell?
Well, I think there's a difference between we, if what we mean by that is very broadly speaking evangelical Christianity, whatever that is, and the we of the person who is listening to this, who maybe is responding in those ways. I mean, I was in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, this 2 weeks ago, and very near Walden Pond. And I was thinking about an English teacher I heard talking one day about trying to teach Walden, and a student saying, "Yeah, but it's got so many cliches." And she said, "What do you mean cliches?" He said, "Well, like march to your own drummer and so forth." And she had to explain they're cliches because Thoreau wrote them, and they just resonated to such a degree that they became cliches. One of those things that I think has become kind of a cliche for us is the Serenity Prayer, contestedly authored by Reinhold Niebuhr, but to accept the things that I cannot control. One of the reasons it's become a cliche is because that is true. And so you cannot control the shape of evangelical Christianity. You cannot control the moment in world history that God chose to bring you about. You can't control those things, and so I think having a sense of needing to get control of them
Mm.
actually creates some of that feeling of what should I be doing? And then if you bring that back to the anger, I mean, one of the things I've learned over the past several years, and Tim Keller actually taught me this, is that often anger is itself at the root of a lot of that sense of loss and guilt and shame, because it kind of gets inner directed. And so in this case, I mean, one of the things again that I will say is reassuring. I'm looking at the little bright spots coming through where I can find them. One of the things that's reassuring is there is no single group of people to blame. If you want to blame, you can't say if only it weren't for
Yeah.
fill in the blank this group. So it's bigger than that. And so I think that ought to provoke us again. What sounds like a cliche, it ought to provoke us to prayer, to a sense of groaning with the world around us, and that's going to be true when we start seeing. I think Ukraine is going to fall to Russia probably very quickly. All kinds of other things that ought to prompt us to pray. We can't renovate an entire Christian movement by willpower alone.
Yeah. I love that call to prayer. And Russell, you have spoken in our live prayer time about this idea of that prayer is oftentimes groaning. It is actually standing with the world precisely where it is in pain and suffering, not running away from it, not pretending it's not there, not trying to seek control such that it doesn't, it's all fixed, but sometimes just being in that groaning place, which means we have to sort of take a hard look at how might the world be suffering such that we can enter that place of prayer and groaning with it. David, I want you to help us think through that. How bad can it get? How loud and painful could the groans get in the next few years?
Boy, that's a very, very good question. So I'll put it like this. Our checks and balances still exist. And for those people who are worried and they think that, well, okay, wait a minute, the courts are not going to be a check on Trump at all, that the Republicans, especially if they keep the House and now that they've won the Senate, They may just get rid of the filibuster and steamroll through. There are a lot of negative things that can happen, but there are also a lot of checks still in place. And one of the things about the federal courts, um, interestingly enough, this is the moment where the president has less legal discretion to implement his agenda than any time in recent American history. Supreme Court precedents have really clipped away at a lot of the president's discretion. And also, the courts have actually rejected a lot of what I would call MAGA reach goals, legal reach goals. So a lot of the checks and balances legally, not in immunity, not in immunity, but that's kind of moot now because Trump's going to win and he's going to be able to order the Department of Justice to drop the cases against him. But in a lot of ways, a lot of the legal checks and balances are still robust. They really are. We have accountability in 2 years. In 2 years, you're going to have another election. And we have seen giant shifts between, say, 2012 and 2014, or 2004 and 2006, or 92 and 94. One of the things about America is these things are never settled. We're just constant rolling political argument. So all of this is happening at the same time as it's very true that Trump has the ability on his own to make some pretty catastrophic decisions. One of them is Ukraine. He can just do nothing and American aid will end and lapse, and it's going to be over right at a point where Ukraine is being steadily pushed backwards on the battlefield when it needs more, not less. So, we could see the collapse of Ukraine, not because of a failure of Ukrainian courage, but because they just don't have the ability to stay in the fight on equal terms with a great power. We could see a beginning of a mass deportation regime that could sweep up a lot of innocents and cause an enormous amount of chaos and confusion in American communities. We could see these things unfold, but at the same time, at every turn, there are ways to contest it. Not so much the Ukraine, not so much foreign policy, but here in domestic policy at every turn. So on the one hand, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, don't worry, everything will be fine. I'm not going to say that. What I will say is I believe Trump is going to push the envelope. But what I will say is don't despair. You have tools to fight back. So there's a huge range of between, oh, don't worry, it's all going to be fine, and don't despair. It's all fine versus total despair. Don't despair. Don't despair. You have tools, but you should be concerned. And there's a big difference between concern and despair.
Russell, I want to ask you about helping people stay out of that despair place. I think it can feel like there's easy ways that actually feel trite and cliche-ish, like you said, and there's ways that actually take us deeper into that place of groaning with God. And a lot of this I see, especially in our chat here, a lot of people talking about the sovereignty of God. Like, how do you sort of hold the concept of sovereignty of God? Because it's easy to want to be like, hey guys, don't worry, God's in control. And there's some truth to that. And yet it can feel like an easy gloss over. And people who are feeling genuine anxious, groaning with the world, feeling the anguish, feel like that's like a whitewashing of real pain and suffering. Help us theologically. How do we like embrace the sovereignty of God in a way that properly keeps out of despair and recognition that God is truly sovereign, but yet does not actually just say, well, we shouldn't really worry about anything now?
Well, I mean, one of the things we have to keep in mind, regardless of how one feels about the election, I mean, in any given election, the temptation is going to be for those who like the result to have this sense of exuberance. We've won, and this is a final victory. And those people tend to get really, really disillusioned very quickly. And then there are people who don't like the result of an election who often get into the mode of we've completely been evaporated, as David said. No matter how this election was going to go, no matter how the one 2 years from now goes, no matter how the one 4 years from now, as much as we don't want to think about it, goes, half the country is not going to be raptured away. So there are going to be no final victories. There are going to be no
Yeah,
final defeats for anybody in a
yeah,
democratic republic right now. So you have to step back and temper both that triumphalism and the despair. When it comes to the way that God is working, there is a way to have a pat reference to the sovereignty of God. I mean, anybody who's lost someone near you, you know that it takes a person who is close enough to the situation to say, remember that God works all things together for the
yeah,
good, because that's somebody who's actually in the whole Romans 8 pattern of groaning along
yeah,
with you and crying out, Abba, Father, with you. That's very different from the person who says, God works everything out according to his purposes. We have to look around at whatever period of history we are in with the frame Augustine had with the fall of the Roman Empire. This is not a moment like that, but a sense of remember the fact that there's tumult. Jesus told us there would be tumult. And Jesus also told us that I will build my church. So that means that we're looking and we're trusting in the fact that God is moving everything to his purposes. But the danger is, whether we're talking about our personal lives or whether we're talking about historical events, is to try to say, well, that means that whatever happens is itself morally pleasing to God. And that kind of that led us to some really dark places in the 20th century when people said, well, let's try to read nature and let's try to read history and see where that's going. And that tells us what God wants or what the spirit of the age wants or whatever. That's not the picture of a fallen universe that the scripture gives to us.
yeah. David, I want to switch back to this sort of like making sense of of this election as a way to sort of even get some vague directions of where things are going. It seems to me that your level of what you feel is possible depends a little bit on whether you read this victory as a very affirmative embrace of Trump and his program, or whether it's more a rejection of the Democratic agenda. Like, is this people proactively saying we want what Trump is selling, or is it that we're not buying what the Democrats are offering? And to me, it actually makes a little bit of difference if I think of, look, the whole country has, or not, not the whole country, half, a majority of the country has embraced a set of characters and values embodied in Trump that I really feel problematic, versus they're just think, well, I don't want the other thing. How do you make sense of reading these results?
Well, you have to do it in a 1-2 sequence.
Okay.
So, the first part of the sequence is after January 6th, Republicans said, no, we still want Trump. Okay. So, if you look after January 6th, this is before Joe Biden took office. This was before any 1 second of the Afghan withdrawal disaster. This was before the border got more porous. This is just before inflation. So, in the smoke is still clearing from the Capitol. And if you look at Republican approval ratings, Mike Pence plunged. Uh, Mitch McConnell plunged. Donald Trump stayed high. So from moment one of the beginning of this next Biden administration, it was very clear that Republicans were still bear hugging Trump. So the Republican support for Trump was all they like the guy because they were still with him even before Biden took office. Okay. Now that's point one. But that's not enough to win. That's not enough. That group of people is not enough to win the election. You had to have more than that. So how did Trump get more than that? And that gets to step two, which is look at as a 1, 2, 3, 4 punch. Step one, punch number one, you look at the Afghan withdrawal and Joe Biden went underwater on approval rating in that moment and never came back. That's when he came underwater. Number two, it was months after the Afghan withdrawal that inflation really spiked. Number three, at the same time, the border surge was immense. And a lot of people were not paying attention to the plea for help from border communities. It was just an immense surge. And then number four, as all of this was happening, it became quite obvious that Joe Biden was very old. Okay. And a lot of Democrats were in denial. And I just don't think a lot of partisans understand the extent to which that clinging to power really blunted some of the character argument, because what the message that was being broadcast by highly partisan people was, don't believe the evidence of your own eyes and ears. Everything's fine. And then June rolls around in the debate, and it was just at that point totally obvious that everything was not fine. And so here comes Trump with a very high base where you have these various body blows. Now, I know the answers and I know the responses to all of this, that, look, inflation was better than in other developed countries, that Republicans had their own role to play in rejecting the border bill, that Biden finally did do the right thing and step aside, that, I know all the answers and the sort of the responses to this. But the fact of the matter was, if you were a person who's particularly hurt by inflation, you were a person that was in a community experiencing the negative effects of the migration surge, and you wanted to register your disagreement with that, there was one main option for you, and it was Trump. So in step one, it was the Republican embrace of Trump in spite of, but not in spite of, in many ways, because of all who he is, that put him in as the alternative to Biden. And then it was the problems in this Biden term that made people more vulnerable to the Trump appeal once he was the only alternative. So it's both and, Curtis. It's both and.
Russell, is there anything you would add to that narrative that David is laying out that kind of tries to construct some sense out of what happened?
I'm not sure how much of this election has to do with responses to inflation, Biden's age, and so forth. Although David's exactly right, that does set a parameter. I think that probably this applies more generally across American life. We're in an age that Neil Postman warned us about a generation ago, where everything has a sense of entertainment and drama. And I think that there's a sense in which Trump is able to speak to that need for meaning or purpose that comes in this kind of entertainment mediated way, in a way that that Harris could not, when what she was selling is, I want to be a boring, responsible president who is what we used to have. And Biden was giving no national sort of rhetorical leading at all, much less a sense of the dramatic that people have come to long for. So I think a lot of it has to do with where American culture is right now.
Yeah. All right. We've been having this conversation that's both emotionally trying to make sense of the landscape, trying to make sense then politically of what the stakes might be, where things may go bad, so that we can join in groaning in prayer with God. And that involves sort of recognizing some of the ways in which the world may be suffering. So we've been talking about that. I want to shift this conversation to now what? Now, what do we do? We've talked a little bit about this in terms of, Russell, like you said, certainly prayer is in all times. This is what is meant by pray unceasingly. It is not that you have to pray every single moment of the day. It's that at no point in your life do you ever cease praying. Do you ever give up on that? And so this is a moment certainly for us to be in prayer. Let's talk about some other relational and spiritual moves that we might need to consider in this moment as the immediate what now step. David, I want to, here's a listener named Gracie said, for those of us suffering from election fatigue, how do we have a political detox without disengaging completely? Now, I realize I'm asking this to somebody who is paid to not disengage, and you
I
are
know.
so, but you must have to do this yourself. Like you can't be
Yeah.
wired into this 24/7. So out of that, give people who are saying, like, I'm not saying I'm going to disengage, but I can't keep this up. What's draw from your own wisdom of balancing engagement and disengagement?
Everybody's needs vacation. I mean, none of us can just do this all the time relentlessly. And we're also different people. So, one of the things that, in our after party curriculum, we talked about, different kinds of personalities and temperaments. Cynic, exhausted, combatant is kind of how we grouped it. And so some of the people who are sort of more inherently and dispositionally combative, they're just like, where do I sign for the next phase of this fight? Saddle me up. But most of us do need to take a deep breath. And so, just as a very practical matter, Trump's not in office yet. There's a time period over the holidays where I think people can maybe unplug and disengage and take a deep breath and wait until late January when Trump is sworn in, and all of a sudden, he's going to have a series of executive actions right off the bat. And so I do think that there's going to be an opportunity here in the short term to just take a deep breath. The other thing is, do it during his term too. Don't. I do think there is a balance between sort of saying, hey, look, Americans don't need to check out in this time. We do need to speak up for the vulnerable. We do need to stand up for the truth. But that doesn't mean 24/7. That doesn't mean constantly. Look at this as a marathon, not a sprint. And I've said this in other contexts. We were never promised that we would live in times of American progress. Generation after generation of Americans have lived in periods of regress. And, we have to settle in maybe for a kind of long slog. It's already been long, for a longer slog. So take care of yourself. You really do need to take care of yourself and know yourself. And if you're seeing bad fruit erupting in your life because of anxiety or depression or just the constant battle, you need to back away. Absolutely, you need to back away. And so, apply the fruit test. If when you're leaning in, there's bad fruit to it, you might need to tap the brakes, because I know for me, when I've not applied the fruit test, I have suffered as a result. And so apply the fruit test. What is your engagement generating fruit of the Spirit? Is your engagement leavened with the fruit of the Spirit? If it's not, you need to start to rethink your approach.
Russell, David talked about taking a potential break these next few months, Thanksgiving and Christmas. Now that, of course, raises the prospect of engaging with family and friends and neighbors who may have been on the other side of your desired outcome of what happened. And this reminds me of a note from our listener named Darcy. She says, many of us have had a rough few years from the standpoint of family and relationships. It feels like we've lost almost everybody. How do we make peace with the loss of so many people we love, or explain their rejection of us for MAGA? And how do we explain this to us, for us and our kids?
Well,
Russell, what does that mean? Well,
I
yeah,
mean,
how do we do this? Yeah.
I think first of all, step back and ask whether you actually have a loss
Mm,
of that person, or whether you are you are both reading through the grid of a number one priority of politics in a way that makes it feel that way.
mm,
So sometimes I've found that genuinely is the case. Sometimes you have people who will say, if you don't vote the way I do, or if you don't support the candidate that I do, or the movement that I do, then that means we can't maintain a relationship. Sometimes that's the case. A lot of times, what needs to happen though is to say, look, you and I don't agree on this. You're not going to change my mind. I'm not going to change your mind. We're certainly not going to do it in a 20-minute back and forth. And so I really love you and want to be with you. Can you just bear with me,
mm,
by saying, I think there have been people in my life that I've had to say, look, I have to talk about this stuff all the time. And I really want to be able to, with you, have a break from all that, and to be with you. Can we do that? Would you
mm.
bear with me on that?
Wow.
And genuinely, when you're doing it in that framing, which is rightful, to say, I need you, not "Well, let's not talk about this because I think you're so repulsive. But
Yeah.
I really need you, and can you help me with that?" I found a lot of people genuinely do respond to that, and move forward. And then, I mean, things change all the time. I mean, if you just look at exit polling from this election, the numbers of over 65 white people who supported Trump went down. Numbers of Hispanic people supporting him went up. I mean, all of that is in flux. So I think take that mentality of so far as it is possible with you, live peaceably with all people, to say,
Mm.
can we have a zone here where we can actually relate to one another as father and son or brother and sister or whatever the relationship is.
Yeah. So I want to share a feeling I had last night as I was going through sort of my tumult of emotions. And I said I landed on this feeling of alienation. And I want to there's alienation, like I said, from this country doesn't feel like it's chosen what reflects me. So I feel alienated from my country. I know fellow Christians were so much part of the outcome. So I feel alienated from fellow Christians. I also felt weirdly like alienated from this moment in time. Like there was something in me that was struggling to feel like I wish it wasn't like this. I wish it wasn't so going to be so dark or so challenging and so hard. And struggling with this alienation of like I don't want to be in this moment. I was sharing with our producer DT Sloffman, and he drew out the quote that was like that expressed perfectly where I ended up in prayer with that feeling. And it's from David from our favorite book, Lord of the Rings, and it's the quote that I know David you're familiar with. It's
Oh,
a
I know
conversation.
what's coming.
You know
I
what's
know
coming,
what's
right?
I,
So it's a conversation between Frodo and Gandalf. And Frodo, of course, has been given a very hard task and a moment in history, in Middle Earth history, that he has to bear a very hard burden, bearing the ring. And he says, I'll just read it. He says, I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf. And so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And that was, I think, my most that describes the moment I left most close to God was this sense of God saying, what is given to you, Curtis, to do in this time, and can you respond to that, David?
I will add
Okay,
to your Tolkien quotes to say one that really struck me. It was a group of us talking, and someone brought up the fact that C.S. Lewis said that this one Tolkien quote from Fellowship of the Ring summed up his entire philosophy of history, and it was this: "That is a chapter of ancient history which it might be good to recall, for there was sorrow then too, and
mm,
gathering dark, but great valor and great deeds that were not wholly in vain."
mm,
And so his point is, whatever the historical moment, whether it's triumphant
yeah.
or defeat, there are actions, little small actions that are not wholly in vain.
Oh,
I think that's a good word.
oh man. Okay, now here's another one. Okay.
oh, this is turning into a Tolkien book study here.
Oh, no, no, no.
Okay,
This is great. This is actually where I thought you were going to go,
okay.
Curtis. But and this is in the Return of the King when Sam and
I know
Frodo,
where you're going with this one.
I
oh
Yeah.
do
yeah,
too.
are deep in Mordor and
Yep.
hope is escaping them. They're at the very end of their rope. And it says, there peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. And if I had to say, is there anything that's like a short version of where I want my heart to be?
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah.
Mhm,
It's there. It is
mhm.
knowledge that there is light and high beauty forever beyond the shadow's
Mm,
reach. And that's where I'm praying that my heart rests in this moment. And praying in many ways to try to resist the
yeah.
temptation to lose sight of that light and the enduring power of that light.
Me too. I mean, I do not want to abandon my post, whatever little post I've been assigned, little corner of the kingdom. I don't want to be found like I've deserted that in this moment. Russell, you talked about this sort of political culture that wants drama. And what strikes me as you read, as we've read all three of our passages, our favorite passages of Tolkien, is Tolkien is actually pointing to true drama. Like, it's not the drama
Hmm.
of the spectator that wants to see drama played out there and be entertained by it. It's recognizing that in whatever moment of history we've been placed in, we have a little moment of drama before us, and we have a time for before us that we are called to small, perhaps even hidden acts of valor that will not be in vain, like you said. And it's important, I think, for this moment, after we take a detox, after we can name our emotions, after we groan in prayer, or as we groan in prayer, to get to that moment of, okay, after all of that, what is the courageous step I need to take, which may again be in my own hidden sphere. It's not in the headlines. It's not going to be spectated upon. It's just going to be my way of enacting. And it struck me that as I was praying last night, like, actually, this is something of a privilege to be called as a Christian in a moment of true drama where there are stakes, where I can take steps that are going to require courage. Not every Christian, throughout history gets that opportunity in the way that we do. I mean, well, none of them do. This is our moment. This is our particular moment that we need to step up to. So let's close this conversation with just talking through, how do we get there? How do we get to that part of discerning what is the little acts of valor that we're called to step into now? Russell, start out with just pastorally. How do we begin discerning that?
Don't.
Okay, say more.
And what I mean by that is, don't look for your sense of drama in little or big acts
Okay.
of valor. Instead, because if you do that, you aim for that,
Mm,
you're going to miss the drama. You're going to end up disillusioned and burned out. Find your drama in the drama of Jesus Christ, the
mm,
story of Jesus crucified, raised from the dead, seated at the right hand of the Father, moving everything mysteriously under his feet, God summing all things up in him. Focus on that. And then those little moments of the drama that you're in, you almost never see those acts yourself
yeah.
in the moment that they're taking place. You will look back and you will say, with anything in your life, you look back and you say, how was I able to make the right decision when we got that bad medical news, or when
Mm,
that car wreck happened, or when there was some historical moment? You don't Most people don't see it and act in that way directly. It comes
yeah.
about indirectly. You're seeking to follow Christ. You're seeking to check your conscience. You're checking your motives, and you're asking Him for the grace moment by moment to do as best you can the things that you think are right. And for most of the really courageous people that I have known, their great acts of courage were not things that they noticed at all. They just
Yeah.
seemed like natural, normal things to them, but other people were watching them. I mean, I can think about people in my life whose little acts of courage have taken me all through my life, and I
Yeah.
guarantee you, if I called any one of them, they would not remember those moments
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most impressive moments to me was when I was first starting out as a congressional staffer working for my boss. He was in a really, really bad meeting with his political party that he was kind of out of sorts with. It was a terrible meeting, and we got in the car, and I was just a nervous wreck. And he said, "You know what sounds good to me? A Jamocha shake. How about that?" And I was like, "Jamocha shake?" I was like, he's like, he said, I did what I thought was right. And we moved on. He
Yeah.
probably wouldn't remember that in 1,000 years.
Yeah.
But it was just that moment of saying, okay, regardless of whether he's doing the right thing or the wrong thing, he has come to the conclusion he believes this is right, and he's
Mm.
not going to be pressured away from it by his own career or peer pressure or whatever. And he wanted a Jamocha shake. I mean, there's those little things that actually do become a Hebrews 11 for other people to say, I actually can take courage in these small moments, whatever they are.
Yeah. David, I'm going to give you the final word. The nature of courage is something I know you've reflected a lot about. And I want to set you up by saying, I think the dominant feeling I've had from people who were hoping for a different outcome is discouraged. That's the word I hear over and over. I'm so discouraged. And it's interesting that word etymologically is so related to courage, that discouragement is the evacuation of courage. It's the dissing of courage, right? So, David, in this moment, how do we not get discouraged, but actually get encouraged, the inflow of courage?
You know, let's just get, we've quoted the heck out of Tolkien. Let's go back to Lewis. Okay. Uh, and, he said one of my favorite definition of courage comes from C.S. Lewis. He says, courage is not just one of the virtues. It's a form of every virtue at its testing point. Okay. So what does that mean? We often think of courage, and when we think of courage, we think of it in the terms of fighting. Do I have the courage to have physical bravery? Do I have the courage to have the moral fortitude to face what's going to come at me online or whatever? But courage, you have to have courage to demonstrate all of the fruits of the Spirit. It takes courage to be gentle when in a cruel era. It takes courage to be kind in a cruel era. It takes courage to love those who are persecuting you. And so I think of right now, the call to courage is synonymous with the call to virtue in this moment. That all of the fruits of the Spirit are going to take courage to manifest in this moment. It's really interesting. When I was a younger person, I thought that the worst persecution that I would face would be sort of holding up biblical values against worldly influences, the Christian sexual ethic, among them. But what I have found is the worst hatred that I've experienced is when I've tried to love in a time of hate. And when you've tried to put out the biblical virtues of loving your enemies, of blessing those who persecute you, that has triggered more fury, more anger than anything that I've encountered in sort of the classic things you're told in youth group, right? Like that, if you say no to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the world's going to come against you, right? But actually, when you say yes to the Sermon on the Mount, that's when, oh my goodness. And so in my view, the sort of call right now, that call to courage, what is the object of that courage? What does it mean to have courage? It goes back to the Sermon on the Mount. It goes back to the fruit of the Spirit. And it's not always going to be fighting hard. Sometimes it's going to be forgiving. Sometimes it's going to be showing grace and loving the person who's spiking the football in your face over Donald Trump.
Well, I want to close here with just a sharing about what I was saying in my emotional landscape last night, where I landed on this deep sense of alienation. And as I was sort of just marinating in that feeling and trying to pray and groan out of that sense of alienation, it struck me that actually this feeling of alienation is not something that I should be running away from. That actually I am an alien. I am, as the scripture says, I am a resident alien. I thought of 2 Peter 2:11, where Peter writes, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles." That phrase is really that phrase of you're aliens, you're resident aliens in this current moment and culture and land that you found in. He says, "I urge you as resident aliens to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." And we've listed a lot of our sinful desires of anger, of despair, of discouragement. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. On the day he visits us. We are, until that day he comes to return to make all things right, we're all alienated at some deep level. We are not actually at home in this particular moment, in this culture, even in this particular Christian culture that we're in. We're all going to have this sense of alienation. And so I wanted to just, if you were feeling that, if you're feeling that sense of alienation, I want to all of you who are listening to know you're feeling something that actually, as Christians, we are meant to feel. And one way that I think we can enter that feeling is by reflecting on some of the scriptures that we've said, some of the words, some of the Tolkien and Lewis quotes we've shared, but also in song. There's something about song that touches us at our deep feelings of both thought and feeling and integrates them. And so I want to close not with our usual Amazing Grace outro, but by a song that comes from our project, Songs for the After Party. It's John Guerra's song, The Kingdom of Jesus, which really sings to this sense of a feeling of alienation in a particular moment in time and a particular moment in a country's history, and what we're called to as members and citizens of the Kingdom of Jesus. So please enjoy this song. And thank you for joining us. We will gather once again next week around the campfire.
1, 2, 3, 4. To what shall we compare the kingdom of Jesus, if not a seed? It's small, it's sown, it's tended and grown, and it's sturdy in you and me. Its branches never break, and its fruit never withers. But his kingdom is not of this world or of any kingdom whose ruler's face is on a penny. He comes to make all things bright, put a new wine in us. He's chosen the small things to outlast the great, the meek and the merciful to shine through the hate. Though it seems some days that hell and its gates are prevailing. Oh, say, can you see the kingdom within us? It's the kingdom of Jesus. Shall we compare the spirit of the hour, if not a sword? It frees us, unites us, enslaves and divides us in violence. Help us, Lord. His kingdom is not of this world or of any kingdom whose ruler's face is on a penny. He's come to make all things bright, put a new wine in us. He's chosen the small things to outlast the great, the meek and the merciful to shine through the hate. Though it seems some days that hell and its gates are prevailing. Oh, say, can't you see we have one allegiance to the kingdom of Jesus? He who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. He who is in us is greater, and he's overcome the world. Oh, his kingdom is not one of slander or rage, but one that is ruled by the Lamb who is slain, who is worthy of wisdom and honor and glory and strength. No pain, no division, no public disgrace will compare with seeing the smile on his face as he welcomes us home as children with places at the table. Neither death, nor threat, nor power can ever separate us from the love of God forever in Christ Jesus. Everything shall pass away, but not the word that's within us. It's the kingdom of Jesus. Kingdom of Jesus.